as a cup of. All right, hello everybody. We'll give people a moment to get in. There's some handouts on that table right there. And while people are getting settled, just want to remind everybody that at 6:30 tonight, we have an Ash Wednesday service happening here in our sanctuary, and you're welcome to it. It would be great to have you. I think it's going to be a really interesting service for a lot of you. I think you'll enjoy it. And I don't know if enjoy is the right word for an Ash Wednesday service. I think you'll appreciate it. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, well, let's get started. And again, we have coffee back there and tea over there. You're welcome to either one. I started a Facebook skirmish this week by evaluating the merits of hot coffee versus hot tea. And I said that I'm giving up instigating contention for Lent. And so I wanted to get it out of my system. And I said something about it, and sure enough, there it was. All right, but that's not for us to worry about. We're going to read Matthew. Let's start with reading the text together. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And afterwards, he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every mouth that comes from the mouth, by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to them, "All these I will give you if you fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. Okay. I apologize for the British spelling of the word splendor. The Bible app that I use on my computer has the British version of the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, because the American version was copyrighted and they couldn't use it. So they used the anglicized version. So typically I go through and just take out all of those superfluous U's, but I didn't do it this week. I apologize for that. Okay, so typically my question is, what is this text about? I think I'd rather start this week with a different question. And that is, did you have any questions, comments, concerns about what was on the video and what we presented there? Jerry.
I struggle with context, and this seems to be an odd conclusion. We've just come from the baptism. Tons of people around, and the things that happen, there'd be 100 people reporting, which in 70 years gets distilled to the story. After this, he goes down and finds the fishermen and calls them, and again, there's certainly people all around. Here we got this flock that doesn't say, and he's led out to the wilderness. Okay, that's reasonable for all those people. Now we don't have, and Jesus came back to the city square and said, "Folks, look what happened.
Right.
I got to tell you."
Right.
There's nothing to indicate what was said. It would have to be Jesus because there's no one else around. But
Right.
Who did he tell? How did he tell? Did he tell it like this? What is?
Right.
There's none of that
Right.
in it.
Yes.
And it just seems very odd compared to the other stories that we read.
Yeah, okay, so that's a great point. I'm going to repeat it for the folks on the Zoom here. And Jerry is actually bringing up two different things. The first is that he's paying attention to the context, which is great. Just before this is the baptism, a very public event. And just after this, Jesus starts his ministry of calling and preaching and all of that, which are semi-public and then big public events. So it would seem like when you have the Gospels being written after years of an oral tradition about the stories of Jesus, you can see where all those stories came from. There were witnesses, eyewitnesses, and ear witnesses who share the story. But this one seems to be not in any place in particular. You know, I mean, it goes around to different points, but the wilderness itself could be many places. There's no one there but Jesus and the devil. So Jerry's question is, how do we know about it? Did Jesus sit down and just give this, you know, the skinny about this event to his disciples once upon a time, and then they passed it on? Or, you know, so it is odd in one respect that you wonder where the origin of the storytelling came from, right? You don't have to wonder about the event. There it is, it's presented, but the origin of the storytelling, just kind of hard to say. Now, if you're the kind, if your theology of scriptures is that God gave the scriptural writers this kind of inspiration, by which we mean knowledge beyond their own knowledge, you know, insight into things whispered behind curtains, kind of the same kind of omniscience that any writer has when they're writing a novel, right? They tell you what somebody's thinking. They tell you what's said behind closed doors. They get to make that up. If inspiration works kind of like that these writers were inspired to write these particular things and therefore were given by God some kind of insight into things one wouldn't ordinarily know, then that's how you would answer that question. I think a lot of folks today would struggle with that view of scripture and feel, I had a professor who said, it's not that the scriptures are the inspired writings of religious people, they're the religious writings of inspired people. People who lived within the presence of God and had that kind of inspiration going in their lives, and this is how they express their religious faith. And that makes sense to me, but then it would say, where did this story come from? And you wouldn't have a really easy answer for it. Yes,
Well, I
Les?
agree. The first three gospel writers have this temptation.
Is that a separate question, or is that related to what we just said?
Well, Jerry's asking where did it come from, and I'm saying,
Why is it here?
you know, it was of some significance because all but John.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it certainly is a significant story in the Synoptic Gospels. So Les is kind of piggybacking the question, and in addition to that, why is this story so important that all three of the synoptics have it? Which will point to what I think goes back to the inspiration of the story is, I think this is how you tell stories of heroes. I think this is how you tell stories of messiahs back in the day. This was how you do it. There's some quality about their life that is different from the regular Joe Schmo. And that quality of their life is that they've been tested and found truth. And the way you demonstrate that is through this kind of testing story. It's not unlike a whole lot of hero stories at the time. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the genre of hero stories, but this is a very common theme in stories about and maybe hero is not the right word, but just superlative persons on a mission, persons who are making a difference. And this is what distinguishes them, and in some ways validates their integrity. So another way you can read this story is that, okay, 40 days, either during which or right after which these three temptations happened. Or this is a story that signifies the kind of ongoing temptations Jesus had at every point. Do you parlay your ability to reproduce bread in the wilderness? Jesus will do that to feed thousands of hungry people. Do you parlay that power into becoming a magician and holding everyone spellbound by that power? Jesus will stand up, against the rulers in Jerusalem, and a great crowd will be on his side. Do you parlay that power? I might even be using the wrong word. Do you use that power and leverage it to take over where the rulers were? So if you look at these temptations as not in the moment, but typical archetypes of temptations that great people face, then you can say, oh, this would have been what Jesus was facing all along. And if you want to talk about the last temptation of Christ, either the movie or even more biblically, Jesus in the garden praying, God, I don't want to die, but if this is the cup I have to drink, not my will, but yours. Again, facing this kind of temptation, do you grasp power or do you let go of power and yield to God? So you can read this not as an event, but as an archetype, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think that's why I posed the question here, how do we read mythology? Are we answering your question at all, Jerry? I want to make okay. I don't want to use your question as a springboard to just go off on my own thing. Yes, Les.
When I read this, somewhere in the back of my mind came, this is archetypal in a different way. I thought of Native Americans sending their young people out for a time of testing before they were fully accepted into adulthood in the tribe.
Right.
It triggered that one.
Right. So that's why I made reference. Les is mentioning a parallel between this event and the way that some Native American tribes, young people would have to go through testing before they went out as warriors or leaders or something. That's why I mentioned the book Arrow to the Sun. It really, really is a marvelous children's book, but it's also just a marvelous book to look at the parallels between the testing that's going on here and the kind of proving one's adulthood that happened in a lot of Native American cultures. Arrow to the Sun. Seriously, you ought to check it out. Yes, ma'am.
The expression, you are the Son of God. How did the devil know that he was the Son of God?
That's a great question. And again, it's prefaced by that conjunction. So it's either if you are the Son of God or since you are the Son of God. But why would the devil be using the phrase Son of God? That's a really interesting question. I don't know. No, so what's that?
I think they're cousins.
They probably have known each other a long time. And again, name tags, y'all. So if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and if you buy into what I think is a more robust theory that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke use Mark as a guide. it's interesting that in Mark's gospel, Jesus is declared the Son of God in the first verse, although I think that's a later addition, at the baptism by the voice from the heavens, at the transfiguration by the voice out of the clouds, and I think, and at the cross by a Roman soldier. And anybody else who calls Jesus divine is a demon. So it's kind of interesting that it's just interesting as to who is capable of reckoning with Jesus as the Son of God. That's partly why in Mark's gospel, one of the motifs is the ignorance of the disciples. They never get around to saying that. At least, when Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am? You are the Christ," Peter says. In Matthew, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In Mark's gospel, Jesus shuts them down immediately. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, heaven and earth, heaven revealed this to you, and you're the rock on which I'll build my church." So Matthew and Mark present that very differently, and their theologies of whether Jesus is openly the Son of God seems quite different. Here, there's it depends on how you translate. It depends on how you translate that conjunction. Either the devil is challenging Jesus to prove whether or not he's the Son of God, or as Paul Ochtmeyer argued, and I think is right, maybe that word should be translated, "since you are the Son of God." And so the question at hand is not whether Jesus is the Son of God, but how should the Son of God act? And so we don't know. John's gospel will tell you Jesus, there's a whole eternal pre-existence of Jesus assumed in John's gospel. And it would not be hard to imagine that Jesus and the devil had run into each other many, many times along the way, cousins, as Jerry wants to put it. We don't have enough information in Matthew's gospel as to what exactly Matthew had in mind of how the devil knew this. But I think almost any sort of, I don't know if this is the right term, I want to say divine being. And when I say divine, I just mean non-human. It could be God, it could be angels, it could be devils and demons, supernatural creatures, non-human creatures. They seem to know that Jesus is Son of God broadly across the synoptic gospels. How, we're not terribly sure. Sue-Ann, did Beryl have a question or someone?
No, she was showing a picture, and so I was asking her what picture she was trying to show us.
Oh, okay, yeah, and they're from the Vatican, I think. I saw. Okay. Well, those of us in the room, sorry, you don't get to see that. Okay. So I want to tell you why I want to use the word mythology with this story. Okay, and I want to first deconstruct the word. We often say if somebody is telling a lie, we say that's a myth. And for us, myth means not true, and that is not the way that word is used in literature. It's not the way it's been used historically. Myth does not mean true or not true. It's not a judgment of truth and falsity. Myth refers to, technically, myth refers to literature where there is interaction between the human and the divine. That's mythological literature right there. Whether it's Ulysses fighting, a demon, or Jesus talking to the devil, or God coming in and meeting Moses on the mountain. That type of literature, according to literary criticism, that's mythological literature. That's how I use the term. I am not making judgments of the truth or falsity of the story by saying this is mythology at its best. It's got Satan or the devil or the tempter. He's called all three. Angels and Jesus. So you have two representatives of the non-human spiritual realm, whether good or bad. And then you have a human, Jesus, in this story, who's human. He's fasting and he's hungry. He's famished. So it's not like he's floating above the earth and nothing hurts me, la, 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 I'm the Son of God. It's not that at all. We're talking about a really hungry, famished human here. And so when you have the supernatural, the non-human interacting with the human like that, that's a mythological story. And my question is, how do we read mythological stories? I think the very wrong way to read them is to read them as a literal story. I think the very nature of a mythological story is that it's not literal. You may battle your internal demons day after day, but understand that when we do that, we're using the word demon to describe something that's hard to describe. We're not literally imagining that you have a demon and that someone needs to cast it out of you through an exorcism. So the interaction between us and demons or angels or the divine, it can be real, but it's not real in the same way that I interact with you. Now, I could be burned at the stake at some point in history for saying that. So let me own it and just say, this is me trying to work out my own theology with fear and trembling. And I say that because if we treat mythological stories the same way that we would treat me telling you how my wife's tire had a bolt in it this morning, she had to borrow my car to go to the pool so she wouldn't take a chance of that coming out and having a flat tire. I could tell you that it's very true. It happened this very morning. I can tell you where I was standing when I spotted the bolt. That's a different thing from when I tell you about how I met Jesus. And both are true. But they're different types of stories. And I need a different language, because when I met Jesus, he wasn't standing there like Chris's tire with a bolt in it was right there. And it's almost sheerly a subjective telling of this story. It doesn't need witnesses. Because if you were standing there, you may not have, you couldn't know what was happening. So, I really want to urge you that when you see a story like this, and it's so evidently a mythological story, true story. In fact, I would say myth is usually more true than literal stories. Then you really have to think about how you read it. We don't know whether these temptations happened after the end of 40 days, just like that, or whether they were taking place during those 40 days. That's what the whole fasting wilderness event was about. We don't know if Jesus was physically transported to the pinnacle of the temple and the devil were sitting up there chatting, or if it was just kind of a visionary thing. Same thing with the top of the mountain. We don't know that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter what shoes Jesus was wearing in this story. This is not a literal story. And if we can develop a way of recognizing a type of a story and reading it in a way that's the best we can, that's appropriate to that type, rather than inappropriate, I think we'd be well off. That's why people who take such a literalist approach to the scriptures, I think sometimes they're not so much wrong. It's just talking about the wrong things. And so I want to invite you to kind of think that through. Okay, yes, Shirley.
Reading this, it reminds me though about the literal and non-literal in mythology. But we teach our children, young ones, that God, Jesus, is good. Satan, the devil, is evil. That we don't do anything else. It's just they represent the good and the evil. And we read, my favorite book when I was young was Aesop's Fables. We read all of that to get the morality from it. But as a child, we don't kind of understand that. We just kind of accept it,
Right.
And then we get older, and all of a sudden we have to have an explanation for all of this, that what you're saying is kind of a part of our life structure.
Right.
To teach
Right.
us how to live.
Right.
It's kind of amazing sometimes when I think about it. I guess it's my old age.
Yeah, well, but that's a great point. So Shirley's mentioning how, think about rearing children and how we present certain ideas to them. I mean, children tend to be literalists, right? That's why you got to be careful. And, the day they look at you and say, there's no Santa Claus, you're in deep trouble, right? What's even worse for a lot of them is when they actually read the Noah story on their own. And it's like, why did I have a little blankie that had this story? This is a horrible story. Who is this God? I mean, it's a tragic story. And so there's a period that children really transfer from being more literalist to being able to kind of encounter truth that is not literal. And but that's part of the growth process. And Shirley mentioned that she would read Aesop's Fables for many years. Fable is another literary category. It's similar to mythology. It's a little bit different because it always does have a moral to it, and it's told for that purpose. So yeah, but again, what you're saying, I think is really important. Is let's really strive to read a story on its own terms. In its own terms, you might have to ferret it out a little bit, but as Jerry said, this is a story that seems to take place more or less here or there. Kind of goes from place to place without saying how many days it takes to get there, right? So it doesn't seem realistic in that sense. There's no mountain on which you can see all the kingdoms of the world, right? So it's not realistic in that sense. There are no witnesses there, so it's not objectively handed down in that sense. So if that's true, then let's treat it as a different type of story, even different than breaking the loaves and fishes, as miraculous as that is. Yes, Sue Ann.
So we have a question from Bill. Would you also then call Paul's experience on the road to Damascus as a mythological story?
Okay, so Bill Postma is asking, I don't know why I'm repeating this, those of you on the Zoom already see it, asking if I would call Paul's experience on the road to Damascus a mythological story. And the answer is yes. And here's why. Paul has that experience in Acts chapter 9. Paul talks about that experience 3 more times, and each time tells it a little bit differently. So this is indeed a subjective experience that someone has, powerfully changes their life, changes their perspective. Kirster Stendahl calls it not a conversion, but a call story. It takes everything Paul had learned prior to that time and recontextualized it through the presence of the living Christ. But as a literal story, why does Paul tell it differently? I mean, why does Luke describe Paul telling it differently? And the answer would be that it doesn't matter the literal details. It's the impact of this story. It changed someone's life and put them on a new road of that for which they were willing to die. That's how real the presence of the risen Christ was to Paul in that story. And so again, it's true, it's real, but is it literal? Well, something happened. Apparently, something happened to Paul. But again, I would treat that story in terms of impact rather than facts and details. That would be one difference between a mythological story, how I would read a mythological story and a literal story. I don't mean to spend our whole time on that because I want to get to the temptations themselves. Yes, Les?
You're talking about myth, but a creation story.
Oh yeah, good heavens, the creation story. You've got to read that as myth. You've got to read it as myth. And when you do, it becomes a beautiful story about the meaning and the power and the beauty and the goodness of creation. If you read it as a literal story, you're going to be caught in arguments forever, trying to figure out what dinosaur bones are because they can't possibly be real, right? Yeah, that's nonsense. That's just nonsense. And in addition, there are two creation stories. The one in Genesis 1 is different from the one in Genesis 2. The order of creation is different in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And then look at Psalm 104. That's a different creation story. Look at Proverbs chapter 8. That's a different creation story entirely. So if you want to take it literally, that's your business. But the scriptures don't take it literally, right? And so why would we read something literally that the writers didn't even take literally? I just don't understand it. And a lot of ink has been spilled, and I'm done with that. Okay, so sorry, we'll get back to that some other time. Now we're going to go to the temptations. We spent half of our time framing this. So let's talk about the first temptation. If or since you are the Son of God, command these stones to turn into bread. That's something you say to somebody who's just been described as being famished after 40 days of fasting. That seems to be an incredible temptation, I imagine. But what exactly is the temptation? I listened to a podcast breaking down the scriptures each week. And, sometimes they just go on and on. But on this one, they were going on and on. And someone said, and Jesus was tempted to break his fast. And I thought, well, I don't see where that's the temptation. Like, if you're really hungry, eat this and you won't be fasting anymore. I don't personally see where Jesus was under any particular command to fast. It seemed to be just something he was doing. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. One of the arguments was that the temptation here is that if Jesus had turned the stones into bread and had eaten that bread, he would have broken his fast and perhaps ruined everything, failed his attempt. I don't know. But to say that, I have to say, I'm not sure what the purpose of the fasting is here. I think if we were accustomed to hero stories, we'd know that that's the way it's done. I think, but I'm not accustomed to hero stories to where I can say that with a lot of confidence. So I want to ask, what exactly is the temptation? We can accept that Jesus is hungry. So to turn stones into bread would satiate hunger. Okay. Is that what he's being tempted to do, is to eat when he should be fasting? Or is it something else? What do you think the temptation is here?
Personal gratification.
Okay, so using, I'm sorry?
Take care of yourself.
Yeah, so using whatever abilities Jesus has to draw on as the Son of God, using it to take care of himself, personal satisfaction, gratification. Great. Someone online said satisfaction of an appetite. Yeah.
I think there's an argument against magic, that expect God will allow you to magically fix something. And this is saying, no, there's a way that life is here that we don't come in and do magic to fix it.
Okay, so Jerry's argument is that this, along with the other temptations, would be an attempt to use magic. And the resistance is, no, there are other ways that we work with that. Am I
All these
right?
healing things that they do out in tents, you come in with polio and I heal you. That seems to me exactly what was happening here, that, okay, we're gonna call on God to change the stone to bread, we're gonna call on God and magically you're healed from your illness.
Okay, so relating the use of magic from stones to bread to the use of magic in healing raises a real hard question, because Jesus is, in fact, going to multiply bread in the wilderness. And that story is kind of a retelling of the manna story, where God's people were 40 years in the wilderness and hungry. And I don't remember if it's in Matthew, but the disciples say, how can you feed hungry people in the middle of the wilderness with no food? It's like, duh, didn't you learn this in your Shabbat school? God does that. God feeds hungry people. Remember the manna story. So that whole feeding in the wilderness is a reprisal of the manna story. Jesus is going to multiply bread, maybe not make it out of stones, but he will feed people magically, if we want to use that term. I mean, that's not incorrect. And he will heal. And he will exorcise demons. He will do things that either the Son of God or someone who's fully invested in the presence of God should be able to do, and not just by our normal human ordinary skills. So why is it wrong to make bread here and not multiply bread there? Sue Ann.
Early says that trust, faith were tested, and that trust and staying the course for God's purpose.
Okay, so the temptation here, bread is just the way it's played out, but the whole idea is trusting in God's ability and for the staying the course, which whatever that fasting for 40 days was, is kind of staying the course on that. Am I okay? Yeah, I think it's not just transparent what exactly the temptation is here. That's one reason why I asked you or encouraged you to read the Grand Inquisitor, that portion of the Brothers Karamazov. And I don't know how many of you have had a chance to do that. Jane tells me that both copies at the library were checked out. So obviously somebody on the Zoom checked out all the library copies. And but this is something that Dostoevsky does incredibly brilliantly in this book. Is he represents this prosecutor who's yelling at Jesus for making the wrong choices. If you had only taken up the ability to turn stones into bread, we would have the world eating out of our hands. And his argument is, you honor freedom and you want people to be free, but don't you know people will cash in their freedom in an instant if you can feed them? I mean, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs in some respects, turned into a political program. You feed the world, they will worship you. and they don't need freedom, they need bread. That's a pretty stunning interpretation of what Jesus is not choosing to do here, which is to dangle the world by bread and to have followers by dint of being able to give them things to eat. Now, I'm more familiar with Mark's gospel than Matthew's gospel, so I'm sorry if this is not in Matthew. I suspect it is. But in Mark's gospel, there are two feeding stories. One is in Galilee. Jesus feeds 5,000 Galilean Jews. And in the other, it's on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, so Gentile territory, and Jesus feeds 4,000. And after that, there's a really curious comment where Jesus says to either individuals or a crowd, I can't remember exactly, something like, "You're just following me because I fed you bread." And he was satiating a hunger and meeting a need, but he wasn't doing that as a way of dangling it in front of people and saying, "Follow me," and leaving a little breadcrumbs to the cross, something like that. That's not what he's doing. So it's really fascinating that Dostoevsky kind of picked up on the power of having control of bread. I mean, this is someone who had known hunger, and he had lived in a time when people were genuinely hungry. And he's narrating, he's writing this story. It's not necessarily his theology, but one way of reading this story, a very suggestive way, is that Jesus is being offered the power of magic to feed and therefore to control the masses. And that's not how Jesus is going to do it. Although he will feed, that's not the purpose of feeding. You see the distinction there, I hope. So I don't know if that's the right interpretation of this, but I do think what it shows us is, oh, this can be actually something much bigger than Jesus at that moment with bread. And I think it opens up our imagination of how we can hear these temptations. All right, let's move to the second one then. Jesus is led up to the pinnacle of the temple and told to jump off the roof. It's almost like an episode of Jackass, the movie, where they just do things that will probably hurt you and film it and make money. So pinnacle of the temple, jump off and trust that the angels will bear you up. In Luke's gospel, this is not the second, but the third temptation, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken. And I usually am. But okay, so what's the temptation here? Magic parachute. What's the temptation here?
You really trust God.
Okay, do you really trust God? If so, put God to the test. You do have an Old Testament precedent for putting God to the test, right? The fleece. The fleece. You've heard sermons about that when you were a kid, and you think you know what that's about, but you're not quite sure. At least that's true of me. Gideon put out a fleece, sheep wool fleece, and it was wet. And the next time he put it out, and it was dry so it was wet when it should have been dry. It was dry when it should have been wet, something like that. And that was proof that he needed, that God will do something. So you can put God to the test is putting out a fleece before the Lord. That's an old phrase that used to be used in the South anyway, to describe testing and making sure God was in this. So that's one possibility. Any other? What else do you think is at stake here?
Self-preservation.
All right, self-preservation. Sure. do something that would normally make people die and have God rescue you, right? So it's not by accident that one of the Gospels says, as Jesus is being crucified, through Jesus' mouth, I could call down 10,000 angels to rescue me right now, to preserve my life right now, but I'm not doing it. So yeah, that's one real option here, is do this and just be that person that doesn't die, because angels are on your side. What else? Anybody? So Anne's left the room, so I don't know if anybody's put anything in the chat. I haven't seen anything bubble up yet. So we'll check when she gets back. What else do you think is going on here? Okay, Beryl has a comment that you'll need to read to us here. Yeah.
In the context of Deuteronomy, God says it's almost as a threat.
Says it's almost what?
As a threat. Says it almost as a threat.
Says what, Beryl? That his angels will watch over you? No. Oh, do not test the Lord your God. Yes. All right. Thank you, Beryl. So remember, I also suggested that you read Deuteronomy 6, 7, and 8. I don't know if you had a chance to do that. I usually don't give you that much homework. But that is an interesting thing. Deuteronomy is kind of when the people of Israel are ready to take the land, and God is kind of reviewing what they've experienced in the wilderness and previewing what they're going to experience in the land. And he says, don't put your God to the test like you did at the waters of Meribah, at the waters of Massah. These are places where the people of Israel complained to Moses because they were thirsty, and God allowed Moses to bring water out of a rock. And the whole idea there was that they didn't trust that God would provide for them, and they put God to the test. God did it. God concedes a lot in the Bible, and gave them watered them. But his argument is, don't put me to the test like you did at those waters. So yeah, it is in Deuteronomy that the text that Jesus cites, don't put your God to the test. It is very much a stern command, not simply like, oh, by the way, never put your God to the test. It's not said without context. It is a stern response to when they did that. So Anne, did you have something else?
Bill says it seems like we have a trend to control self, environment, and empire.
I'm not sure I caught that, what that means. I'm sorry. A trans control empire? What?
Control self, environment, and empire.
Okay. Okay. Bill, I'm not quite understanding that comment, and I'll try to respond to it better, but if you could reformulate it perhaps for us, that might be helpful. We're going to move to the third now, and the third is that Jesus is taken to the highest point of a mountain where he can see all the kingdoms of the world, right? This is great mythology here. If you were that high up, you'd be surrounded by clouds. All right, all the kingdoms of the world. And the language is, all of this I will give to you. In Luke, I think he even goes further and says, because it's been given to me to do this. All of this I will give to you if you will bow down and worship me. What's the temptation here? Let's.
Like a drumbeat, those 3 chapters of Deuteronomy to me are saying, keep your eye on God and God's commandments. Forget all the others. Because time and time again, the writer comes back and says, here are the commandments of God, do them. here are the commandments of God, do them. Don't pay any attention to any of the other stuff.
Okay, so Les is pointing out that in Deuteronomy 6, 7, and 8, it keeps circling back to these are the commandments of God, do them, trust them, rather than all these other things. Deuteronomy chapter 6 has that great passage that we call the Shema. Hear, O Israel. It's called the Shema because that's the Hebrew word for hear. That's the first word. Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echa. It means, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You will love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul, or all of your being. And that's the Shema. You are to recite this to yourself in the mornings and recite it in the evenings before you go to bed. This is the premise by which you live. The other part, love your neighbor as yourself, comes from Leviticus. Jesus is the one that merged those together. That's part of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it's a very strong it's not so much monotheistic as if there's only one God in the world. I'm not sure if you can make that argument from the Old Testament, but it's mono-allegiant. You can only serve one God, this God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You will love the Lord your God with everything you've got. That's part of these 3 chapters together. And so I think Les is right. It keeps circling back to why would you serve anybody else? It is like a drum beat. But, do you think throughout his life, Jesus was faced with time and time again saying, should I worship the devil or God? Does anybody, that's part of why I'm saying this is mythological. It doesn't really come to us presented in such a bald way like that. For those of you on the Zoom, we are experiencing some sirens outside, which happens about 4 times a day here because of our location, and we learned to shut doors. Okay, so what's the temptation here? Yes, Jerome.
I think it's the offer of personal gain to follow Satan.
Okay, the offer of personal gain to follow Satan. Yeah, and let's treat that like a piece of whatever that stretchy stuff was when we were kids, and yeah, Play-Doh, I don't know, whatever. Yeah, let's stretch it a little bit because it's rarely ever presented to us in real life as Satan. It's usually presented to us as the means justifying the ends, as a small compromise, as the price of doing business, as the way the world is. And those are the little things that we leverage to climb up the ladder or to gain more, to acquire more kingdoms. So in the myth, it's either this or this. In real life, it's more like you're always tempted to bend your trust in God, your allegiance to God, just a little bit, to do good things. It would have been great if Jesus had been in charge of all those kingdoms. We wouldn't be dealing with half the stuff we're dealing with now, right? And in Dostoevsky, it's like, you had to love people's freedoms. Why didn't you order them around? Why didn't you take over? If you had been in charge, we'd all be fine. But no, you love people's freedom, so you refuse to do this. So it's left up to us, the church. Now we have to do it. That's what the Grand Inquisitor is saying. So yes, it's that temptation to serve the devil. And that's the thing we have to stretch a little bit to say, what does it mean to serve the devil? I just don't know if there are really that many genuine devil worshipers in the world. I know they had Satan Con in New Mexico a couple of weeks ago. Whatever. Talk about literalizing metaphors. Those people scare me less than those who are in positions of power and who are making those small concessions in order to increase their power or their wealth, power. Yeah. And I say that thinking, dang, I'm in a position of power. How often do I face this temptation, and in what manner does it express itself, either to increase wealth or power? Right? This is real. This is a real temptation. If we leave it starkly like, oh, bow down to the devil or go to church, it's easy to go to church. If we press it a little more, it becomes much more nuanced. Yes, Shirley.
And it seems to me always to come back to good and not good, or good and evil. And it should start with us teaching the children. And I think of the Bible because everything we read, it's really Jesus talking mainly to adults. And yet there's that one place where the children are playing around.
Yeah.
And he says to the disciples, let them come to me because this is the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
And so as adults, we have to teach our children
Okay.
the difference.
But yes, I don't argue at all with what you're saying. I think this text is a little bit different than that.
You don't think that we're excusing plagiarism or lies or doing things, quickly, or teaching them that part of life that however you can get by with doing things quickly that maybe aren't right or that sort of thing?
I'm sure there are people who are either giving that message explicitly or implicitly. Yes, I would think even a child who is raised perfectly is still going to face this temptation. I guess that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So we do our best, and I don't want to.
No, I understand.
Yeah. So yeah, this is when we start to look at these temptations, not so much about literal bread, but about the power of holding people's existence in your hands and what you do with that. And not so much about jumping off a literal temple and magically floating to the ground upheld by invisible angels, but the power of using magic or leveraging that, putting God to the test. And if we think of not so much bowing down in front of the devil, however we imagine that creature to be, but the whole thing of our hearts going after something other than the glory of God, then these temptations become a lot more powerful. And I think then we can start to see them as something that Jesus would face at virtually every point in his life and ministry, and something that we face at virtually every point in our life and ministry. And then it becomes really kind of powerful text to us. Okay, it is 10:31, and I am doing my best to honor your time. So I am going to go ahead and bring this to a close. So this is our first week of Lent, and this was our first Lenten text. I'll be preaching on this on Sunday, and we will begin our Lenten season tonight at 6:30 in the sanctuary with an Ash Wednesday service. I think you will be very happy that you have come if you are able to come. Starts at 6:30. Thanks, everybody, and thank you, Sue Ann, for your work today. Okay.